Before we get into this, I'm just going to say there's a lot of heavy topics in this. You have been warned. Imagine yourself feeling alone your entire life, struggling with depression and anxiety. Trying to find some peace of mind, occasionally you light a cig and visit a place, a nearby town. Meanwhile, anxiety and depression controls your life every day, while you also attend college with nobody beside you. But one day, you meet a woman at college, Sophie. She has troubles much like you, but you help her get through it and begin to find yourself attached to her, feeling that you love her. Then, one day, confessing your feelings, she rejects you, you being just a friend to her, and leaves, the heartbreak destroying you. Struggling to cope, turning to a switchblade you somehow attained, you acquire new scars, and turn to morphine to numb the black ocean of emptiness, loneliness, and misery inside you. That, dear viewer, is essentially the backstory to the topic of today's video, Simon Henriksson from Cry of Fear. As to who he is, Simon is the protagonist of Cry of Fear. Giving an overview of his character, little is known about his school or personal life. Something his doctor, Dr. Purnell, his counsellor, notes as topics Simon refuses to discuss. Simon has been known to self-harm as indicated by the cuts on his left wrist when the player heals using the morphine syringes. Story-wise, it's also suggested that Simon lives with his mother. The significance of this could be that she possibly helps him with his visits to Dr. Purnell. However, this is not made fully clear as the cutscenes outside of the game's events set within the book Simon is writing show him in a different apartment on his own. There is also no mention of a father or other relatives throughout the story, so functionally they don't exist as far as the story is concerned. As previously mentioned in the intro, Simon is known to suffer with depression, and he only has one friend outside of his home, that being Sophie, who he had romantic feelings for, albeit they were rejected. All of that being a very general overview of his character. Further elaborating on his background, which I used as the intro for this video in a summarised form, there's a bit more information on Simon. Hinted through dialogue and flashbacks, Simon grew up in his hometown of Kirkville with his mother. As mentioned, nothing is mentioned about the father. It's also hinted that Simon's mother is overprotective, shown by the text he gets throughout the game, meaning that Simon likely did not socialise with others in his younger years. During his lifetime, Dr. Purnell has stated that Simon has lived with psychological problems for a long time, which has been diagnosed to be anxiety and depression, which Simon himself claims to be generated by his loneliness. Simon occasionally taking a train to Stockholm and walking lonely around the city as a way of coping with these feelings, and an ashtray in his apartment shows that he's an occasional smoker. And from the appearance of Simon's bag, it's implied that he's a fan of heavy metal music, the logo on the back of his hoodie adding to this as well, albeit this changes to suicidal black metal after the main events of the plot begin. And in regards to Sophie, she is referred to Simon as being the only male at college who would actually help her through her troubling times, making her life more bearable. But after Simon confessed his feelings and she rejected him, Simon insisted that he loved her, she backed away from him saying that she had to leave for somewhere, and her rejection completely debilitated him hardcore, and he went as far as to blame himself, that she would choose to reject him. And for a while, Simon was completely unable to move aside from the pain of her rejection, but this completely depends on gameplay choices made by the player throughout the story. Simon will either allow his emotions to fester to a point where it punishes both him and Sophie, or despite being hurt, he'll move on. And the last part of the intro that involved the switchblade and the morphine, I don't even need to really elaborate on that because there's not much to it. Anyway, moving on to the actual events of the game and its story. Simon, as we've already mentioned, diagnosed with anxiety and depression. Before the events of Cry of Fear, as seen in the first cutscene of the game, he was the victim of a hit and run, in which he came across a man who was on the ground in the middle of the night, tried to help him, and then was slammed into a wall by a car, crushing his spine, which crippled him from the waist down and confined him to a wheelchair for the rest of his life, subjecting him to further mental trauma which drove him to becoming reclusive and spiteful of his own life. Dr. Purnell being assigned to Simon as his psychologist after the incident. Dr. Purnell going on to use cognitive therapy as a treatment method. The method consisting of Simon being instructed to write a book about his emotions and anxiety to get all the trauma out of his head, and the trauma he had suffered from what he insists on calling the Black Day, the day in which he was crippled, which is essentially called vent writing, which is an actual well-known method people use for coping with their emotions, as it provides a safe space to let out everything going on in your head. But anyway, Simon authored the book as instructed and the events of Cry of Fear begin. The events that unfold being a metaphorical depiction of Simon's mind and the battle to purge his inner demons through his writing. The actions taken during the game showing us how well the therapy works, which is going to vary depending on the critical choices you make throughout the plot. But ultimately, each boss fight represents a major point in his life to where he has suffered some sort of trauma, or the many metaphors in game representing the state of his mind. And in addition to this, the Simon we play as throughout Cry of Fear is in fact a mental projection of Simon himself, acting as a self-insert into his own book so he can actually combat his traumas. The fate of both Simons depending on what ending is unlocked due to the actions made throughout the game. his fate now being the section we're going to discuss. The main single player story has 4 endings. The first 3 endings involve Simon committing suicide with slight variations of the fates of the other characters. The real Simon ending his own life is shown metaphorically in his mind, as the projection you play as is subjected to another nightmare, and forced to work his way to sick Simon still stuck in his wheelchair, in which a fight ensues and he kills the real Simon, via killing sick Simon who is in a wheelchair and a stand-in for the real one, ultimately killing himself in the process and ending the game with one of the first 3 endings, and Simon leaving a declaration in his book which varies depending on what choices were made. But there are 2 major choices in the game that decide which ending you get: if the player kills or spares the monster known as Carcass, and if they trust Dr. Purnell with the gun or not. Sparing Carcass and refusing to trust the Doctor results in ending 1, the worst ending, in which the therapy fails outright and Simon develops a deep hatred for the world around him. He begins to show signs of possible paranoid schizophrenia, believing that the world viewed him negatively and were looking down on him because of his disability, never caring about him all along. Ultimately, his delusions and depressive spiral causes him to feel betrayed by Sophie, and makes him feel like the Doctor had made his depression worse and was mocking him. So he proceeds to go psychotic and kill both of them and then himself. And he wanted to kill others but simply couldn't due to his situation making that impossible. He then proceeds to write a suicide note and kill himself, and the nature of the note being macabre and sinister. He expresses his belief that the world was laughing at him because of his disability, tries to justify himself killing Sophie and Purnell, confesses that if it weren't for his disability he would have done far worse, and attacks whoever finds his remains verbally, wishing that whoever finds his body to be haunted for the rest of their life. Ending 2 is unlocked if Simon spares Carcass and trusts Dr. Purnell with the gun. In this ending, Simon shows respect for Purnell and his efforts to help Simon, but ultimately believes that it was futile. He came to the resolution that his life meant nothing and he was unable to move past the pain of the rejection, and he possessively murders her to keep her to himself, willing to leave her for anyone else to have. Before then killing himself, he then leaves a suicide note in his diary apologising to Purnell for the results of the therapy, but overall thanks him for actually trying to help him. And then there's ending 3. This is unlocked if Simon killed Carcass but refuses to trust Purnell with the gun. It's pretty much a reverse of ending 2. While Simon still feels the pain of Sophie's rejection of him and feels extreme guilt because of the damage his slip into depression and psychosis did to her, he's able to forgive her and moves past the rejection, even coming to regard her as the only person who truly cared about him. However, he couldn't trust Dr. Purnell, and comes to the conclusion that his treatment has only made his condition worse and the book has showed him how broken he really was. And so he proceeds to murder Dr. Purnell in a fit of self-absorbed revenge before taking his own life, leaving behind a suicide note pleading with anyone who finds his remains to not show them to Sophie, showing that he actually cared about her in the end. These 3 endings being the bad endings of the game. And with those, now to talk about the 4th arguably good ending, unlocked by killing Carcass and trusting Dr. Purnell with the gun. In this ending, Simon doesn't take the life of Sophie nor the Doctor, and does not commit suicide. This being prevented by a hallucination in which Book Simon arrives. The real Simon then has to battle his way through another nightmare while in his wheelchair, and engages his mental counterpart in a running gunfight, eventually managing to defeat Book Simon and shooting him to death, showing that his mind no longer needs to rely on the visage he created, and that he's finally been released from the collective stress of his trauma. The psychotic hallucination ends and it's revealed that Simon did not really shoot his twisted self, but instead 2 police officers who entered his apartment to check on him. After this, doctors testify in court that Simon was having a psychotic episode, and although he feels guilty for killing the officers, he is committed to a mental hospital, in which Dr. Purnell continues to act as Simon's counsellor and mentor, a service he is grateful for. Sophie regularly visits Simon in the hospital when she is allowed, the doctors saying that her visits are, and I quote, destabilising him, although Simon makes note of the fact that she has found a new male friend and wishes her nothing but the best, Simon even going on to give himself a happy ending in the book, which represents him finally coming to terms with the depression, allowing himself to start being treated. And with that, those are the 4 main endings of Cry of Fear. I'm going to be skipping over the secret ending and the Doctor's story ending because they aren't canonically connected. David Leverhoff from Afraid of Monsters has appeared in the secret ending, but I think that's more or less just a joke or a cameo ending. But then there's also the co-op campaign ending, which I'm going to go over now, which serves as a final epilogue scenario, in which several police officers enter his apartment and then enter his book mental realm, intending to, for unknown reasons, change Simon's past and save him from the hit and run incident, the campaign concluding with them travelling through time, and managing to arrive to location just before it could happen to arrest the driver and prevent it from ever happening, preventing the events of the game entirely. A short scene then happens showing Simon and Sophie having apparently begun a relationship after all, walking down the sidewalk holding hands, I personally don't feel like this ending is canon because it just kind of undoes the whole plot, and it's probably just an alternate storyline sort of like Doctor Mode, in which you play as Dr. Purnell. And with that, now to move on to the trivia before I give my thoughts on the character. Firstly, Simon's full name can be found on the strange package earned in Ending 4, which gives you the secret ending, when the package is delivered, to the mailbox located by the college. Secondly, the back of Simon's hoodie appears to be the logo for a public event called the Freedom Music Festival. Thirdly, possibly for user-friendly purposes, Simon dual wields a handgun or a melee weapon in his left hand, and the other optional item like a flashlight will be in his right hand, which could imply that Simon is left-handed, or ambidextrous if I'm pronouncing that correctly. In real life, the P345 is not an ambidextrous weapon and is designed for right-hand shooters, so it's likely that Simon wouldn't find it easy or comfortable to use with his left hand. Fourthly, Simon's first model is still found in the first nightmare sequence when he punches the mirror. His first model can also be found in the Depressed Simon Easter egg. Fifthly, one of the hurt sounds of Simon is in fact cursing. The line is "ah, fan," which translates from Swedish to "ah, damn." And with that covered, now to give my thoughts on the character. My thoughts are, Simon's story ultimately represents the devastating consequences a life-changing injury can have on someone, not just physically but mentally and emotionally. Even more so when that person is already vulnerable. In addition to this, the negative effects one can face when psychological treatment goes wrong is also a main focus of the plot, plus the consequences of that depending on what ending the player gets. The book version of Dr. Purnell shooting Simon in the game is a metaphor for the potential real-world damage Purnell's treatment could have had on Simon, and stems directly from this theme. And all the enemies Simon goes against draw from this narrative, as they are all reflections of his mental state and treatment process. One of the enemies in particular is literally named after a medication, the citalopram, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which as a medication is known to have side effects that may make a person's problems worse. The citalopram likely being a medication Simon was prescribed by Dr. Purnell in the real world outside of the events of the book. As in some of the endings, when Simon kills himself, he mentions taking some extra pills, these possibly being the medication he was prescribed. And his journey through his collapsing mind via the book is all metaphorical, but is functionally similar to the goal of Silent Hill, to force character growth, as far as the plot is concerned, albeit with distinct differences and methods, which is fitting given that Silent Hill was a partial inspiration for Cry of Fear. But it's also worth noting that the monsters in both games are designed differently, and exist for different reasons. The ones in Cry of Fear are all specifically connected to Simon, while throughout the Silent Hill franchise they're connected to various different people. James Sunderland has Pyramid Head, and is a manifestation of his guilt. The Abstract Daddy represents Angela's sexual abuse by her father. The Butcher from Silent Hill Origins is connected to Travis Grady, symbolizing the brutality of the cult known as the Order, Travis's inner rage and pent-up anger, among other creatures connected to other characters. But ultimately, both games have these monsters to serve the same purpose. They represent something, key to the plot and to the main characters. Silent Hill just does it in a more flexible way, by having the cult and the dark gods involved. While Simon's is stiffer, so from a writing perspective it's harder to bring an external character outside of his story into it. There's no explainable mechanism for the monsters becoming physically real, so the plot of Doctor Mode physically and chronologically just cannot fit in with the main game's timeline. Nor can the multiplayer co-op ending. And that, my audience, is what we call a writing choice based limitation. The way you as a writer can get around this is by pre-planning these kind of things out and preemptively setting up something earlier in the story that would allow you to get around this, which necessitates you as the author having a vision of what you're doing, which is pretty easy to do as a writer by simply writing up a plot graph and using that to have a sense of direction, or creating a timeline of events that need to be followed. But yeah, with that, that's my thoughts on Simon, but the video is not done yet. I need to say something. Firstly, due to all the monsters in Cry of Fear being symbolic and having their own connections to Simon, which I think I mentioned before, I'll probably do a video someday detailing the connections to him in better detail. Secondly, oh, and on a related note, considering this fits the theme of what we just talked about, I made these anti-suicide hotline number posters a while ago and I'm going to show one on screen now. And I'm going to provide a link to it in the description on Steam, so if you want you can help save others' lives too by either sharing it as a PNG online, or by printing it out and putting them up around wherever you wish. I'm sure those who need it will be very grateful. In addition to this, I'll be putting all those hotline numbers in the description too. I do genuinely hope that these posters actually do something and save someone. And that's really all I have to say, which sort of pretty much just brings us to the end of the video. Actually, before I go, I'm just going to say one last thing. If you feel alone, like you've had enough, like you can't keep going anymore, there's something I need to tell you. You matter. You're loved. There's people out there who care about you and they're counting on you. They will miss you when you're gone. Just please, stay safe and do something nice for yourself. And with that, that's it really. I genuinely hope you have a good day, good night. See you around. Goodbye.